الله أكبر الله أكبر.
Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the Islamic Center at New York University podcast, coming to you straight from the heart of New York City. We're building an amazing Muslim community here at ICNYU where everyone is welcomed and respected no matter where you're from or where you're at. This is the place to be. So open your ears and your heart and come along with us on another life-changing journey. Bismillah.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. We're going to today we're going to continue on what we discussed last week, which was written on the board, which were the conditions outside of the prayer. So things that you need to have outside of the prayer for the prayer to be valid. And today we're going to start talking about what is obligatory within the prayer in order for the prayer to have validity. So today we're going to talk about the integral components to the prayer once you're in the prayer. Last week we talked about the conditions that had to be met outside of prayer. And now we're going to talk about this within the actual performance of the prayer itself. And as we go through it, just keeping in mind that we're kind of going in an order. So whether you were born into Islam, you were a recent convert to Islam, you converted a while ago to Islam, or you're still exploring Islam, there's also going to be embedded in this kind of a structure in which one can actually teach somebody how to pray who either is a convert or somebody who is just returning back to faith and they're starting to pray for the first time in their life, right? Because the idea isn't that you need to know how to pray in order to convert to Islam, right? Or somebody takes their shahada, there's no prerequisite course of study. And you want to be careful because quite often we utilize language that's very absolute, that can create challenges for people as they're kind of getting acclimated into things systematically. So remember, for those of you here, when we talked about wudu, we went into wudu really in depth so that you know what are the different elements of wudu. So in any scenario, you know how to be able to adapt to the performance of wudu. It's a little different when you're sitting in your office place versus a classroom versus in your home or in a place surrounded by Muslims versus you're the only Muslim that's there. So I want you to understand this in the context of just where you might have learned how to pray, but not learned how to pray in the ways that we're going to talk about it right now. Does that make sense? Right? And so at the end, we'll answer questions. But the way that we're going to look at this over the course of the next couple of weeks is in the prayer itself. So this is now in prayer, not outside of prayer, but in prayer. There's going to be three ways we're going to understand this. The fard, the wajib, and the sunnah, parts to the prayer. Right? The fard meaning the obligatory, the wajib meaning the necessary, and the sunnah meaning the recommended. When we talked about wudu, to recap really quick, talked about what these words mean in Arabic and in English, right? Because even in English, we don't necessarily utilize these terms, right? Like somebody asks you, why are you doing what you're doing? You don't say, this is an obligation of mine, right? Likely it's not in kind of just common jargon. So this is something that is, from a religious standpoint, understood to be definitive in its evidence as well as definitive in the meaning of what it's invoking. Does that make sense? And something is wajib in that it's a little bit less in terms of the definitiveness of it. So in the Hanafi school, which is what we've been looking at, these are things that are still important to do, but they don't have as definitive, it's more probabilistic, like what the potential meaning is within this, right? So if somebody says, how do you know you pray your salah, your daily prayers as a Muslim? Because in the Quran it says again and again, iqam as-salah, right? Establish the prayer. And there's not really other ways to understand that. Just establish the prayer means establish the prayer. Do you know what I mean? And we're going to go through the conditions here that are the obligations. And what you want to know is that if any of these are left out, then the prayer doesn't count. It's not valid. The way you want to conceptualize it is kind of like the likeness of your skeleton to your entire being. This is what's creating the frame of your prayer. The wajib are elements that are necessary, and if one of these is left out forgetfully, not purposely, but forgetfully, we'll talk about this next week, it doesn't invalidate the prayer. You can do what's called a prostration of forgetfulness that then remedies that deficiency. You don't have to know what that means right now. We'll talk about it next week. But this is still something that's important. Just on that spectrum, it's of a lesser degree of obligation. And then the sunnah acts, so the wajib in relation to that example, like the fard is the skeleton, the wajib is now going to be kind of the body that goes on the skeleton. And then the sunnah parts to it, which we'll talk about next week and potentially the week after, this is what like beautifies that body. Does that make sense? So what I want to do as we go through this is to talk about this, but to also demonstrate some of the things that come up so that we're aware of what it is that we're talking about here. So the first component to this that is an obligation is what's called tahriman, or what a lot of people do when you see them start the prayer, they say this initial Allahu Akbar, right? It's a glorifying of God. The term Allahu Akbar is going to fall under this category, just so you know. So here, in the Hanafi school, the conditions we talked about last week outside of prayer, some people would say this is also an obligatory condition outside of prayer, and some people say it's a condition of the prayer, right? The same thing, practically speaking, you have to do it. This is a phrase that just has to be something that is glorifying God at the level of an obligation. Somebody could theoretically say, Subhanallah, glory be to God, and it still fulfills the obligation. Everybody ends up saying Allahu Akbar, but just so we can understand conceptually, that is what is there for validity. Someone could say any statement in glorification of the divine. It has to be a full sentence, like a full statement in that sense. This is in relation and quite often connected to the intention that we talked about last time. So you're making an intention to pray the prayer as an outside condition. You're not in prayer yet when you're making that intention. And now, to signify that you are in this state of prayer, you're doing something that becomes a glorification of God. When we pray all together at sunset, we're going to say Allahu Akbar to signify the start of the prayer. The second part to it is going to give a little bit more understanding, and we'll talk about this in a little bit more detail, is now standing. If you are physically able to do so in the course of your prayer. It's a fard in the obligatory prayers. You have to stand in the prayer. If you don't have the physical ability to stand, then you are not required to stand. But if you have the physical capacity to stand, and the obligatory prayers in the Hanafi school, you are required to stand during the course of the prayer. Does that make sense? When you're standing in prayer now, the actual standing, just so we can understand it, right? In this room, the Qibla is this way. Standing means that you're standing upright. So you're not gonna like feign humility and be hunched over. Standing as a description is that you're standing straight enough that when you're standing, that your hands, they're not able to touch your knees. Do you get what I mean? And the mechanics are things that are important in the course of the prayer, but you're standing upright when you are in prayer. Now I want to give you a couple of things to understand, because you're going to stand in prayer, whether you're praying alone or you're praying in congregation. There's some distinctions that are made. And just to be aware of it in terms of what you're going to be met with. If you go into a masjid or you're praying where there's other Muslims, quite often you might find somebody, when they're standing, they will put something in front of the area that they're going to prostrate. This is outside of this conversation of what's obligatory, but just so we understand it, because there's going to be a lot of things that can come up just in the course of like you're standing in the prayer that you want to be ready for, right? So when somebody is in prayer, the recommendation is that you put something in front of you that essentially functions as kind of a barricade between you and the person that is walking in front of you. So where I am standing in prayer, I can put anything that is even as small as a marker that goes in front of me. If I move here, is that a problem?
No, that's all right.
Just so everyone can see. Can everyone see me here? Yeah. So if I'm here and I'm in prayer and I put this in front of where I'm going to prostrate, what it allows for is people to walk immediately in front of that thing. In Arabic, it's called a sutra, right? It's a cover. The hadith says, even if it's a blade of grass, you want to have something that's there that kind of blocks people's ability to walk in front of you. If there's no sutra, then essentially twice the length of your prostration is an area. So it's not like somebody's praying all the way back there and there's nothing in front of them, then nobody can walk in front of them in the entirety of the room. When you pray in congregation, the cover of the person leading the prayer counts for everybody else, right? So that's one of the things. Why is that important? Because if you're walking in a mosque or you're walking and people are praying separately, and somebody's standing in their prayer and you come and walk in front of them or try to, they might stick their hand like this to indicate don't walk in front of me, right? They're not trying to shake your hand, okay? And you just want to be mindful of that. Because I know a lot of people who they don't know, right? How many times do you meet Muslims and they're constantly shaking hands, Assalamu alaikum, etc., etc. Now when the person's praying, like, and they stick their hand out, they want you to not walk in front of them. That's what they're doing. Does that make sense? And they're going to do that while they're standing, and you just want to be mindful of it. If you, by accident, shake their hand, it's okay, it's a funny story to tell somebody later on. But that's not what they're trying to do. Now say I'm standing, and I'm not praying just by myself. I'm praying with two people. What is going to happen is that the person leading the prayer has to be standing in front of the person that is praying with them, to the extent that the person who's praying next to them, their heels have to be behind the heels of the person leading in prayer, right? Can you come and stand up here? So if we're praying together, we're going to essentially just stand like this, and that suffices. Does that make sense? Okay. Now say the two of us are praying, standing side by side, right? And then a third person comes and joins us. There's a couple of different scenarios here that can happen, right? One, can you come here? Yeah. Say we're praying and all of this is behind us, right? There's a lot of stuff behind us. There's no room for these two to move back. So in this scenario, the situation would be such that we want to have a separation between the one leading the prayer and the two people praying behind. Because all these things are back here, this scenario would now have the person leading the prayer move forward. Does that make sense? Yeah? So if you walk into a mosque and somebody's praying like this and you join them, two people, and the person leading the prayer takes a step forward, you didn't do anything wrong. You guys can sit down. I'm going to call you back up in 2 minutes. Just be ready. Right? They're not moving away from you because you broke the prayer or messed up the prayer. But formulaically, if there's a person leading and someone praying next to them, and there's a barrier behind them, and someone comes here, then this person is going to move up because there's no place to move back. Does that make sense? Okay.
Is that for men only?
You have, like, in some schools of thought that there's women-led jamaats also,
But
right?
must the heel, if it's like Shafi?
You still have to be in front.
Okay, the
Yeah.
heel should be in front.
The only school of thought that I know of, right? Well, forgive me if I'm wrong, but in the Maliki school, the imam doesn't have to be in front of the congregation. People can pray in front of the person leading the prayer. Yeah. But in the other schools, that you have the person leading the prayer has to be in front of everybody. Yeah? So here, say now, for example, all three of these people are praying, and for whatever reason, they just don't know that you're supposed to move. The prayer is still valid. It still counts, right? But just so you're aware of it, if this barrier is not here, then there's a couple of things that would happen, right? So you want to come up again? Can everybody see you when we stand here? You sure? Okay, come stand. And you come up too. So you're going to just join from back here, right? He's going to enter into prayer first. He's going to make his intention to pray the prayer. And one of two things will happen in this scenario now. He's going to either automatically be aware that this person is here and then take a step back. You want to do that? And now we're good. Or he's not going to know that this person's back there, right? He's a deeply pious person. He doesn't know what's going on in the world around him. Some dude just came and stood behind him. He doesn't know, right? He's intoxicated with God in the moment. So he's in this place where he doesn't know. So he's in his state of prayer, and all he's going to do, he's going to tap him, or he might even pull him back. So if somebody does that to you while you're praying, they're not trying to like mess around with you or test you in some way. You can sit down. But they're just now getting to a place that is the mode formulaically that we stand in the course of the prayer. Does that make sense? And again, if there's not like movement, right? It doesn't mean that it's invalid. Do you know what I mean? But I just want you to be aware that if these things are happening, don't get thrown off, right? And if somebody comes to tell you something and they're like, you didn't move, you messed it up, this or that, right? Just sometimes you gotta smile and nod to people. But essentially what's gonna happen is if there's two people praying, a third joins, this person is going to move back and the rows start building out this way. Okay, I saw a couple of hands. What were they? Yeah.
Just real quick, if it's just two people, right? I've seen some people where the guy leading the prayer and the person with them, their toes are aligned, and then other situations where the person that's not leading the prayer is like standing slightly behind them, like, which is
The toes can be aligned because your foot is not based off of the front of your foot in terms of a line. It's based off of the back of your foot, right? So if you're here in Ramadan, you heard me say this like 50 times, right? Line up from the back of your heels, not the front of your toes. Do you know what I mean? So, like, your foot is bigger than my foot. And so if his toes are lined up where my toes are, the back of his heel is still behind, like, the back of my foot. Do you get what I mean?
So you can stand, if it's just two people, you can stand directly next to the person leading, like the imam.
More or less, right? You're close to them, you know?
Okay.
Even if you're a little further back, it's fine,
Okay.
right? But the person leading the prayer should be in front in some capacity, you know?
Okay.
Yeah.
Couple of things. Another scenario where you may have to move is like during Jumu'ah, sometimes spaces will come up in front of you and you may have to move forward.
Yeah, we're going to
One-
talk about,
Okay.
yeah.
Just to let people know how many big movements they can make before they invalidate the salah.
Yep.
Just to let them know.
Yeah.
Does the first one say tahrinat?
Tahrima.
Oh.
Yeah.
And then 2 questions on that. Do we know why it has to be a full sentence? And do all of these apply to all sects of Islam and all?
This is in the Hanafi school.
Okay.
Yeah. These are the fard, right? Why are we doing this? Because some of you have been Muslim for a week. Some of you are not Muslim yet. Some of you are born into Islam, but you're trying to reconnect to prayer and you haven't prayed in years. You want to have, at the end, we'll talk about the scenarios, right? The next point will help to illustrate this a little bit because the third point is recitation. In the Hanafi school, you only have to recite in the fard prayer in the first 2 rak'ahs, or of the sunnah prayers, like in every rak'ah, just a small portion of the Quran, any of it. The smallest verse of the Quran says thumma nadhr, right? You could say to fulfill the fara'id just that in the prayer, and that's it. Because you, as somebody who's new to Islam, you have a legally valid reason as to why you won't know all of these things. Because when you take the shahada, the prayer becomes obligatory upon you, right? And so we're understanding this not in the context of you want to assume you don't already know these things. You know, I'm teaching somebody how to pray at a pace that makes sense for them as a new Muslim. There might be people we meet who have converted to Islam or they prayed for their whole life, right? I have to pray my whole prayer. I don't have, as a default, a valid excuse. There's other instances where the fara'id are important to know, because say you woke up today and Fajr ended at 5:56, and you woke up at 5:54, the same way when we talked about wudu, these are the obligatory parts of the wudu, these are the recommended parts to the wudu. You're not going to spend the 2 minutes you have to pray Fajr doing wudu in its entirety. You're going to do the obligatory parts, and then because it's an obligation to pray in the window of time, right? If the time passes, then you have missed the window of time. That's religiously impermissible. It's haram to do that. So what trumps is praying in its time, and you got 45 seconds left to finish Fajr in its window, you're going to do this. Do you get what I mean? There's different perspectives that say, hey, like you might be recommended to make up that prayer or not. And we'll talk about the nuance of that. But understanding this, not in terms of what you already know, but assuming just a blank state from the beginning. Does that make sense? Yeah?
Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead.
So for women leading women in prayer, so the rules that you showed, all of them apply?
In the Hanafi school, there's not an opinion about women-led prayer. In the other schools, there are, right? But it's going to be something similar. I don't know the rulings in these other schools,
No.
so
In
I can't
other
comment
schools,
on those.
A woman imam does not stand in front because it's based on Aisha, Sayyidina Aisha. So she would lead the prayer standing in the middle with 2 sisters on the other side of her. So there needs to be 3 sisters, is my understanding, and she stands in the middle, not in front. So I will learn more inshallah about the feet because I don't know about that, but you shouldn't stand in front.
Yeah, great.
And
Okay, so also with the standing now, right? We're in the previous class, we talked about conditions outside of the prayer. So you're standing facing towards Mecca, right? You're already oriented towards the Kaaba, but you're going to be standing facing towards Mecca. One of the things that comes up when you're praying in congregation, rooted in this idea of gaps being created, is in its initial state, you're going to be standing with no gaps between you and the person next to you, right? So the recommendations of it being shoulder to shoulder, and you'll hear people say this out loud, shoulder to shoulder, foot to foot. But the specificity of that is something that, at least in the Hanafi school or others that I've heard as well, is that it's not meant to be something that's definitive, right? That when you stand up, you don't want to engage in excessive movement that is now in a place where you are changing the kind of natural state of standing to elongate your stance, to have your foot be touching the foot of the person next to you in every single rak'ah, every single time. Does that make sense? Yeah. And you'll find people will do this differently, and some people will say that it's got to be there no matter what, toe to toe, and most people would say that that's not what the understanding is of that hadith. You can't have large gaps between you and the person standing next to you, right? There's not supposed to be like these huge distances, you know? If you came here during Ramadan, we would deliberately, between prayers, make sure people were lined up as they were supposed to be lined up, and there wasn't bags between people or like gaps between people and these kinds of things. In the Hanafi school, if you move an excessive amount of times, it breaks your prayer. If you're also doing things that indicate that there's something that is not done in the course of prayer, like that breaks your prayer, right? You can't pick up your phone in the course of your prayer. Do you know what I mean? Right? You can't also talk to somebody else on the phone while you're in prayer, you know? But fundamentally, what you're going to do when you stand in congregation is you're going to be standing too close to the person next to you, right? You're filling up those gaps. And then you're going to have movements just as you go up and down where some of the alignment is going to change a little bit. But the focus is still on the prayer, not necessarily on the posture that can in and of itself also become a distraction. Do you get what I mean? Right? So if you're praying next to somebody in a congregational setting, there might be somebody next to you who is very adamant about this. And if they're trying to get their foot right on top of your foot, this is why they're doing it. Just let them be. You know? That's like something that they've been taught, and that's fine. But for yourself, as you stand, you don't want to have like a focus that says it's got to be kind of rubbed up against another person. You're just ensuring that there's not great distance in between. Now, if you're in a place where there is a gap that pops up, right? Say we're praying, and in front of me, behind me, there are things. You can't be aware necessarily of something going on behind you. Like, how would you know that, right? But if now there's the prayer started, and there's an opportunity for you to move to close the gap. You're moving, but not excessive movement. Right? In the Hanafi school, if you move more than 7 times, like it's considered to be too much, and it breaks the prayer, right? So you're not engaged in that kind of excessive movement like so much. Do you know what I mean? If you have ever been to Mecca and Medina, for example, people line up to pray and there's gaps in the rows in front of them. Like if I'm here and I see a gap all the way like up there, I'm not going to push my way through to fill that gap, you know? But where there's a reasonable kind of movement that isn't excessive, that's going to have you like go at a point where somebody looking at you from outside the prayer saw you and they're like, this, like what you're doing is not prayer at that point. Do you get what I mean? Does that make sense? Here also, what you want to be mindful of, that'll happen, like in the course of your standing, is, well, we'll talk about it as we go through like the other obligatory parts of the prayer. Yeah.
Sorry, not
No, go ahead.
to find a point on this, but how much time is there between each movement that it is consecutive? Like how much of a gap can you leave between the movements so that it's not consecutive?
It's not about consecutiveness, at least in the Hanafi school. It's just like total movements over the course of it, right? You know? Yeah. Any other questions on standing? So standing is a part to this, right? In the Hanafi school, in your voluntary prayers, you don't have to stand. it reduces the reward, but it's not an obligation, right? So you see a lot of people, particularly from the Indian subcontinent, they do this a lot. They'll pray their fard in congregation, they'll stand, they'll go through it, and then when they pray their sunnahs, or they pray nafil, they just stay seated on the ground, right? That's something that, in particular, the standing is relevant to the obligatory prayers in the Hanafi school, right? You should still stand if you can in like all of your prayers, but if you don't in a voluntary prayer, that is something that's valid. The standing is a fard act, an obligatory act in the obligatory prayers in the Hanafi school. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, in the course of your standing, you're going to have recitation. And this is not the recitation that is within the category of what's wajib and what's recommended, right? We're talking just at the place of what is an obligation. And it's important to understand this because there are scenarios. So you can recite any part of the Quran, just a small verse of the Quran, and that suffices as a minimum for the obligations, right? In the Hanafi school. So there's a hadith, for example, where companion is being taught by the Prophet how to go through the movements of the prayer, and he says to this companion, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that just read from the Quran like what you know of it, right? He doesn't specify in that hadith reading the Fatiha in particular. So these hadith, what the people who are making these rulings and adopting methodologies, they're looking at them all together. How do they communicate with one another? There's other people who would say, there's hadith that says like the Fatiha, there's no prayer without Fatiha, right? In the Hanafi school, they would say that in and of itself is not strong enough to indicate it's a fard, it's a wajib, it's a necessary thing. When you learn your prayer, you have to say the Fatiha. We're going to talk about this next week. You have to do what's there. But as you're learning, which can be very daunting for many people, right? You're going through it. Somebody took their shahada on Friday. There was 2 brothers that took their shahada, right? Allah increase them. If you take your shahada, the prayer is obligatory upon you at that point, right? So the leeway isn't, okay, you get a month to just not pray, but in understanding that all you're going to have to do in a language that you don't know is going to essentially be this. And it can be any small verse. You could say, Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. And then that's it. You could say, Qul huwa Allahu ahad. And then that's it. In this scenario, right? What are other situations that this might come up in? What if somebody wakes up and they have to perform ghusl, right? A man wakes up and he realizes he had a nocturnal emission during the course of the night. A sister finishes her menstrual cycle towards the end of a period of prayer. And there's only a short window of time, and you got like 10 minutes to do your ghusl and put on some clothes, do all of those conditions that we talked about last week, and then get the prayer done. So now there's 2 minutes left. Do you get what I mean? The exiting of the prayer time is something in relation to this. You're going to get done what you have to at a minimum. Or you're somebody new to this prayer thing. You're new to Islam. You didn't pray, born into a Muslim family, and you're just learning prayer for the first time. You don't speak Arabic. And even if you speak Arabic, Quranic Arabic is different from regular Arabic. Do you get what I mean? So you're in a place where it's not the destination, but it's a starting point. And you are reasonably learning then outside of that and fulfilling the obligation. Does that make sense? Does anybody have any questions on that? And this is really important because people are going to say things like, it's better to do this or it's that. Yeah, like these things are there. That's what we're talking about. This is the skeleton of it, and then we're going to talk about what is the body that goes on the skeleton and how do you make that beautified in some capacity. But you got to pray the prayer, and now you think also in kind of the constraints that you might have. Yeah, go ahead.
Can you pray in English in addition to the Arabic?
This?
Yeah. Or
No.
Is it just strictly Arabic? And then like maybe like for Sunnah, can you pray in English?
What some people make exceptions for is within the course of your prayer making dua in certain parts of the prayer, but this has to be in Arabic, right? But like the smallest verse in the Quran is 2 words. It says thumma nadhr. You don't have to know what it means, right? You don't have to like it's just that's it. You're not worshiping a feeling when you're praying in Islam. You're praying to God. And the mode through which you pray to God is based off of how God has outlined this in God's messenger. If somebody says the Prophet Muhammad never prayed like this, well, yeah, because the Prophet Muhammad prayed like this, like the whole thing. But that's not how Sharia functions. That's not how fiqh functions, right? You have what is obligatory. You have that whole spectrum that we talked about. Obligations, prohibitions, what is neutral, recommended, disliked, all of these things, right? So what is also reasonable is going to vary for person to person. Do you know what I mean? Somebody might have a natural aptitude towards language, You might be in a place where we had people here who, before they took their shahada, they observed Ramadan for 3 years, prayed with us every day. It's different. You're not in competition with anybody else, but you want to understand that as a starting point, you're still working towards something. So in the course of the prayer, you're doing what is required obligation-wise, and then from there, you are outside of the prayer learning what needs to be learned to get you to these parts that we're going to talk about next time. Yeah?
Can you clarify what you mean by what you can recite after Surah Al-Fatiha? Because my understanding is it has to be it has to make sense.
You don't have to recite Surah Fatiha here.
I mean in fourth prayer, right? It's not like...
We're going to talk about all of that next week,
Okay.
so it's to not confuse people.
Okay.
This has to be just a short verse of the Quran, right?
That's my question.
Yeah.
It's
A verse is going to have a full sentence to it.
So, can I say Alif Lam Mim, and that's it?
It's a verse.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
But that's what I'm saying, right? You don't want to think about it experientially, right? And you don't want to use words when you're talking to somebody who's new to it that claims something is absolute when it's not. Do you know what I mean? Because the alternative is what, right? If you took your shahada at Maghrib time today, right now, Maghrib is fard upon him after he took his shahada. He's going to pray in congregation, so he's following along with everybody. But if he went home to pray Isha, are we telling him that by the time Isha starts in an hour and 20 minutes, he's going to have to know how to recite Fatiha, 1 long verse or 3 short verses of the Quran, every invocation and every posture of the prayer? He's been Muslim for 5 minutes. Do you see what I mean? Right? That's why it's really important to understand that where and how it might have been given to us is not necessarily given to us in the way so that we know how to teach it also. Right? Because you have to know how to pray in order to pray, but knowing how to pray doesn't mean that you know how to teach somebody how to pray. They're different things. Do you get what I mean? Does that make sense? Yeah? Yeah, go ahead.
Is this also an opportunity, with that obligatory recitation, if you just need a verse, to find a verse that kind of, sticks out to you, if there's something that resonates with you within that sentence, or...
Yeah, it could, but I would say, it doesn't have to be that, right? That's not a condition of it. You just have to say the verse.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? So whatever is going to get you through the fulfillment of the obligation, right? And it can be a verse of Fatiha if that's what you're working on, right? but it's got to be something at a minimum that's there, right? Any other questions on that? What time is Maghrib? What time is it right now? Okay, so we still have some time.
7:46 right now. Yeah, I have 7:55.
Okay, so from here, what happens next is the bowing. In Arabic, this is called the ruku'. I changed tahrima to invocation, right? So it's in English, right? So bowing is also like a posture movement now, right? So what we're saying, when you move from the standing to the bowing, in terms of the obligations, you don't have to say anything in the bowing position in terms of the fara'id of it. The posture of the bowing is such that what constitutes bowing is moving in such a way where your hands can now like rest on your knees. Do you know what I mean? So the ideal is that your back is in a place where it's making a 90-degree angle when you're doing that. But if you go down and you stay here, it still counts. Does that make sense? Because your hands are touching your knees. What you don't want to do is give religious significance to something that's not there. So somebody says, I'm going to go down and I'm just going to like go really down, right? And you're like, well, that's not like, the merit to that is not rooted in anything of our tradition, So you want to get to a place where your back goes to the 90 degrees. The same way we said standing necessitates the standing essentially is that you're standing in such a way where your arms are not able to touch your knees, right? So if you were hunched over in your prayer, your hands could touch your knees, then that's not standing, right? You're standing straight. When you're bowing in this way too, where it allows for your hands to touch your knees. Does that make sense? Okay. Any questions on that? No? Yeah? So one thing you want to be careful about, my son learned this the other day. I don't know if any of you have ever had this happen to you, but we were all praying together, and he was standing, I was leading my wife and my daughter and my son in prayer. My son's 7 years old, right? He's not like a 25-year-old man. He's a little kid, I don't know if you've ever seen Kareem run around here. He's got like a unique relationship to his prayer. We were praying in Ramadan. He would stand to pray. He'd run out the door, drink some water, come back and stand next to us and kind of do his thing. So we were praying in the house, and he put his prayer mat behind where my daughter was standing. And as he came up, my daughter bumped him with her backside in the prayer. And Kareem just lost it, He didn't know what was going on. It was so funny to him. And at the end of it, he's like, Baba, do you know what happened to me? I was like, what happened? He's like, Didi bumped me with her butt, right? And I said, Kareem, today you reached a milestone as a Muslim, because every Muslim praying in congregation has had somebody in front of them smack them in the face in some way, shape, or form, right? So when you are going through this, it's just inevitably going to happen at some point in time. You're going to stand while somebody else is still down, or something's going to happen. But just be mindful of people bumping you as you're going through things. Okay. Number 5 is the prostration. And in terms of the obligatory parts of the prostration are going to be your forehead, hand, knees, and some part of your toe, right? The fara'id, not the wajibat, right? So the obligatory parts to this, right? We're not saying what is the complete part. We're saying at the minimum what one is going to be required to do. What needs to happen in that prostration being valid is that everything should ideally be on an even plane, so that there's not elevation to certain parts versus others. So if you're prostrating, the limit between how say you were in a place where there's just a bump in, or like something elevated in front of you. Somebody put like some books in front of you or something, right? You're in here, there's a bag in front of you. You can't have your head be elevated more than half a handspan above where your knees are, right? If that is, then the prostration isn't complete. Does that make sense? So the ideal is that everything is just kind of flat in front of you, you know? You can put something in front of you when you're praying, right? If I pray and I put this where I'm going to prostrate and this just hits my stomach, right? That's different. But if I'm in a place where I'm praying on top of it, reasonably speaking, right? Like it's creating now like a challenge to the posture of the prostration. Does that make sense? Yeah? Okay. And then the last obligation is the final sitting. And that sitting is done to the length of the tashahhud, which, for those who are not familiar with it, in terms of its length, you could read it in probably like 10, 20 seconds, right? So a sitting that's in that extent. There's things that are very clearly missing from here that in the course of your prayer, or even when we pray in like 5 minutes, you'll notice like we didn't do a lot of this stuff because those are going to get filled up here, and then some are going to get filled up over here as well. But in this place, you're just understanding what is the obligation upon you, right? It's a Islam 101 class. Some of them trying to build a relationship with our prayer. After like maybe years of not praying, we could have forgotten how to pray. Someone taught us to it. Some of us are new to Islam, right? And also, you can use the opportunity. Somebody comes to you and you want to teach them about their prayer in Islam. You're going to teach them in a way that has like a sensibility to the learning experience. Somebody comes on day one and says to you, I just became Muslim this afternoon. And you're like, you have to learn how to pray. Like, great, teach me. And you say, well, the first thing you have to learn is Surah Fatiha. Right? Which might seem like the most commonsensical thing to say, but in reality, the first things that they're going to be required is what we're talking about here in this kind of list, you know? And as they start to do this, because the prayer is obligatory upon you as soon as you become Muslim, they're going to have to get to do these things as you then move through like a learning process around the rest of it. Does it make sense? Okay. So next week, we're going to talk about what are the necessary components. So here's the skeleton, and this is what we're going to build off of, right? So when somebody says, what can I do? I'm new. You remember we talked about the conditions. One of the conditions was that praying within its time, that knowing that the time has entered. So when the time has entered, as you are navigating, learning how to read Fatiha, a part of the Quran, like the different invocations and the bowing positions and the prostrating positions, you're still just doing a minimum of this because you have to complete the prayer. And it's a valid reason as somebody who's new to it that you're going to do just what is obligatory. Does that make sense? Any questions on that? Yeah.
I have a question about the standing part. So what about when you're in a moving vehicle, like you're in a car? So do you have to like get, if you're praying your phone, do you have to get out of the car and like find a spot in the parking lot to pray, or is it?
Yeah, you have to stand if you can stand, right? There's some people who would say that praying an obligatory prayer on a moving vehicle in and of itself is a problem, but most people would say it's fine, right? You can pray on a plane, you know, but you are in a place where like considerations have to be made, right? But this is also just like with a generalization. If you're in a place where you have a fear of safety, for example, for some reason, right? You're in a place where it's something that kind of adds different variables to it. But in the most general understanding, yeah, if you're driving Like you can get out of your car to pray, then you get out of your car to pray. You know what I mean? Yeah. Does that make sense? Okay. So why don't we take a pause? We'll pray Maghrib and then come back just for a little bit. I know last week we were here for 2 hours, which I didn't mind. And I asked the halakha that I do on Monday night, which also went for 2 hours because we started at 6 and then at Maghrib. That is 2 hours like too much. I don't want people to go on a marathon. So we probably won't go all the way till 9 like we did last time, just because we don't want to exhaust people. But spend some time and just kind of thinking about this, how it might be relevant to you as you were kind of going through the learning process. And then we'll come back and just talk a little bit about prayer itself, what it kind of, how it fits in more specifically, and then we'll wrap up. Okay, so just on the question that someone had asked about the congregation in the Shafi school, in terms of how they stand for when it's women praying with women, they say the least amount of people needed to form a congregational prayer is 2 people. If there are only 2 people praying, then the followers stand slightly behind the imam, such that their toes are slightly behind the heel of the imam. This applies to a male leading another man, or a woman leading another woman. If it's a congregation of 3 or more people, then the women stand in rows, and the female imam stands in the middle of the front row. But there is a difference of opinion if by middle it means that they're standing in line, or that the female leading the prayer would stand slightly ahead of the front row to distinguish that she's leading the prayer. Does that make sense? Yeah. So in the Hanafi school, there's no concept of like a women's congregational prayer, right? But as the question was brought up, as per the Shafi tradition, that's where they would think about it. So if people want to move in who are going to be sticking around, just so as people come in to pray, they don't pray near the corners. You can come pray over here if you like to. You don't have to pray back there. If you want, come stand over here. Okay. So what I want us to do for just kind of the balance of this is think of a couple of things, right? Like one, why are like these mechanics an important part to all of this? Do you know what I mean? Because we want to preemptively deal with whatever can potentially come to us, right? There's going to be people who are going to only be able to give to us what they have in the first place. So you might meet somebody who teaches you to pray and say that from day one, you have to be able to do what we're going to get to in its entirety in the next couple of weeks, as opposed to here's the fara'id. You're a new Muslim, you got to pray your prayer. It's obligatory upon you, but you're still going through this, right? This, if you compare to what we just did versus what is the bare minimum, there's like so much that we did that's not listed here, right? And I want you to think about this experientially, because where and how in the course of now entire windows of time that we talked about last week, remember I drew the diagram, degree markers, etc. You're new to it, let yourself be new to it, right? You're trying to learn it. Be patient also with those who are just learning it, right? Some of us are going to be in a place where you are going to have a relationship with somebody who's Muslim. Their family might be Muslim, right? They might not be able to explain to you that you are going at a pace that makes sense for you, not at their pace. Do you get what I mean? Because if they've been Muslim their whole life and you've been Muslim for a week, that is not the same thing. Do you get what I mean? You're learning, you're going through a reasonable learning process, still nonetheless. But if you see what it actually takes to just go through this, you could do this in a matter of like 25 seconds, 20 seconds, realistically speaking. Do you get what I mean? And why we want to put that out there is so that the anxieties that come up, how do I do this in my place of work? How do I do this, at this time or that time, right? Fundamentally, the notion in this religion is that God understands his creation. You get what I mean? So if there wasn't an opportunity to understand that if I am born in New Jersey and I'm a native English speaker and I convert to Islam and I literally have to pray the prayer that is incumbent on me to pray, how could I fundamentally know how to do it every step in a language that I've never spoken? Do you get what I mean? Because not everybody converts to Islam because they found beauty in the prayer, or they practiced being Muslim for a year or 5. Some people did, right? Each person's got kind of their own trajectory. I've met people who literally have seen us praying from the park, and they came up here and they said, "What are you all doing?" And we told them, and after like 30, 40 minutes, they're like, "I want to become Muslim." They don't even know we pray 5 times a day. You know what I mean? And then we're going to be like, great, here's this list of things that you suddenly now have to figure out how to do in the next 20 minutes. Do you get what I mean? Right? And this is why they say different opinions are a mercy. You know, we think about it in terms of a recognition that I'm not in a lonely journey, but I'm not where the other person is, you know? And you don't want to become somebody's homework project that they now assess you based off of where they're standing in relation to religion. You get what I mean? There's a sister I was talking to just recently, and she's, you know, trying to figure out, should I start wearing like a headscarf or not, hijab? And she said, all these people told me there's no point to just trying to wear it a couple of days and then not wearing it a couple of days. If you're not going to wear it every day, you shouldn't wear it, right? And she's like, what do you think? I was like, don't listen to stupid people. That's what I think, right? Like, most people don't realize what they're saying in their head doesn't sound the way that the person receiving it is hearing it. Do you get what I mean? There's a kid who came to this school, and like in the first semester, just in the fall, he came and sat with me. He's like, I'm born into Islam. I've never prayed in my life. I said, okay. And then he prayed for the first time in congregation. And he said, today is the first time I've ever prayed in congregation. I said, great, man. Congratulations. A month later, he said, today's the first time I've ever prayed 3 times in a day. And then a month after that, he said, today's the first time I ever prayed 3 prayers in congregation in my life. Now he's praying 5 times a day. He's on top of his prayer. He is in a place where he came from informs where he is right now. Do you get what I mean? But he's got to start somewhere. Does that make sense? Why am I saying this? Is because you will meet many Muslims who they are going to give you perspectives that don't allow for there to be a trajectory that has a sense of just how you can kind of develop in a way in relation to some of these things. Do you get what I mean? Yeah? The mechanics are not unimportant, right? So in movement transitions, it can't look like it's just one big motion. You know what I mean? So when you're going from position to position, there's got to be some rest in there, right? Because if it looks like I just was standing and then all of a sudden I did everything in like one swooping motion, then that's not different motions, right? That then is just one kind of consistent. So you're going, and then there's stillness, and then there's stillness. You know what I mean? It doesn't have to be like tons of stillness, but just stillness, you know? We were praying, my kids were praying behind somebody for, it was like prostration, it was like long, man, right? And my kids, mashallah, they're amazing, but they like to talk a lot, you know? And we finished, and in the prayer, my son is like, is he okay, right? And I'm like, what do I do right now? I don't know what to do, you know? And then afterwards, he's like, Baba, what happened? Like, did he fall asleep? I was like, no, Kareem. He's like, Baba, you said fall asleep, your wudu breaks, right? I was like, go to sleep, Kareem, you know? But understanding, like, when you're starting off. Do you get what I mean? You got to be patient with yourself, right? If you are born into this religion, you're teaching somebody how to pray, you're leading them in prayer, you have to understand, as they go through the learning process, they're not going to be able to say everything in each position as quickly as you might be able to say it. Do you get what I mean? So you could blaze through Surah Fatiha, which is a wajib of the prayer, according to the Hanafi school, and you finish its recitation by the time somebody who's just new to it got through its first verse. You see what I mean? The Prophet Muhammad, when he led people in prayer, peace and blessings be upon him, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he was conscious of the congregation he was leading. So if a baby cried, he hastened the prayer. He shortened his recitation. He didn't want to create undue hardship for the mother, right? There's elders praying with you. You're not going on a marathon in the course of the prayer, especially in praying congregation. But also just be mindful. And for yourself who's new to it, it's okay, as you're going through it, that you go through it slowly. Do you get what I mean? And you're adding in components as you're learning them. The goal isn't to get faster as an objective, especially at the expense of mindfulness, right? But the goal is to build and create a relationship to this in a way that allows for it to still be a spiritual act. Because in Islam, we're not praying, but we're praying to God. Do you get what I mean? It can get really agitating if the expectations are unreasonable, and it doesn't function in this way of better. Because how is it better, right? I'm a 40-year-old man. My job is to be Muslim, right? Literally, there's an office right here around the corner and an office down the hall that's my office. I can walk here any point in time of the day I want to. How can I reasonably tell somebody who's new to this that you're supposed to be doing it the way that I've been doing it for decades, and then use a term like it's better if you do? Do you get what I mean? You might actually be in a place where somebody is teaching you this, and they're not giving you the steps, that it's not actually better for you, it's actually making it harder for you. Do you get what I'm saying? Does that make sense? Yeah. So start in a place where you know how to make wudu, make your wudu well, right? You honor the timings of the prayer, and you can literally do this whole thing in 10, 20 seconds. Do you know what I mean? It might not be spiritually engaging if you see it through the prism of what's not there. But if you see it in terms of you're exactly where you're supposed to be in relation to it, and what you're yielding to is not, I'm going to pray because I feel something through the prayer, but you're shifting and it's, I'm going to pray because God told me to pray. Does that make sense? The performance of our daily prayers is an obligation. The 5 daily prayers comes to us in a particular moment where the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, he goes from his home to the city of Jerusalem and then ascends into the heavens on a night journey. In Arabic, it's called the Isra wa Miraj, and it's very vividly described in the prophetic tradition. One of the things that happens is in Jerusalem, the Prophet Muhammad prays with every prophet ever sent to mankind. And if you go to Jerusalem now, you can actually see the spaces that are there, that are preserved, that these stories are attached to. And when he ascends into the heavens, he meets a different prophet at every level of heaven. And as he gets to the last level, he engages in conversation with Moses, peace be upon him. And then from there, the prophet has direct interaction with Allah. How that functions, we don't know, right? The way we have physical prostrations in this religion, sometimes this religion also requires mental prostrations, right? There's not any type of anthropomorphic understandings within Islam as a tradition. In the course of that interaction, one of the things that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ is given, peace be upon him, is this gift of daily prayers. And what it starts off with is 50. And then he comes down and Moses says to him, what happened? And he says, I got 50 prayers. And Moses says, go back. Your people are not going to pray 50 times a day. He said, my people, they left behind what was required of them. Yours are going to definitely leave it behind. The prophet goes back and forth again and again. And each time, Musa alayhi salam, Moses, he says, go back. They're not going to do it. Until it gets to 5. And Allah tells the prophet, you will have 5 that you would perform, but it'll be written as if it's 50. And he comes down, and Musa alayhi salam, Moses says to him again, like, go back. The prophet says, I'm embarrassed now. Like, I can't keep going back, right? But the fundamental idea in this religion is that we were made to do 50. That was like the idea, but it was reduced to 5. And this, as a class of like basics of Islam, regardless of what any Muslim has a capacity to do in the sense of what they believe or what they might tell you based off their own practice, Muslims are required to pray 5 times a day. Not when it's convenient, not when it's easy, within the windows of time. We're going to talk probably in 3 or 4 weeks about what happens if you miss a prayer. You got to make it up. But if anybody's telling you as a default, it's okay that you like sleep through one, or you're at work, so just pray the rest at home, that's not how it fundamentally works. So where also you want to build a relationship with the timings, to understand that doing as you're learning what is required in the fara'id can also allow for that to be done in a shorter amount of time that doesn't really have too much that goes into it fundamentally. You want to try your best. You know what I mean? I don't know what everyone's circumstance is in the room, but I know I've met enough people who are exploring Islam, who convert to Islam, recent or otherwise, or even born into it, right? I sat down with somebody who once told me that her grandmother told her that if you miss Fajr, it's okay, because there's another prayer that you can pray that is called the Subh prayer, that after Fajr, you just pray that if you missed Fajr. And I said, no, it's not a thing, right? Like, you pray Fajr in the time of Fajr. If you miss Fajr, then you make up Fajr because you're required to make up Fajr, you know? People will tell you all kinds of things. There's 5 prayers in a day. Where there's different opinions is not on whether there's 5 prayers or not, but on what the timings are of those prayers. What the windows of time are of those prayers. In the Sunni tradition, there's 5 separate windows of time. In your generic prayer, when you're traveling, there's different things. You can combine prayers and stuff. The Shia tradition, there's still 5 different prayers, but there's also room to pray Asr and Dhuhr together. They call it Dhuhrain, and Maghrib and Isha together, Maghribain, but they're still praying 5 separate prayers. In the Hanafi school, there's a different perspective on when Asr starts in terms of it being a little later than what most people would say. But everybody agrees there's 5 of them. And it's fundamentally considered to be the most foundational and important kind of ritual within the course of a Muslim person's life in their relationship to God. So you want to make sure that you're consistent with it, that you have a relationship to it, but in a way where also you understand it's an exercise and that the performance of it with regularity is what's a necessary mechanic in order for it to yield like the inward transformative kind of things, right? But it's not one of those things. So if somebody says to me like, hey man, I'm new to this, I don't know how to do this around my family. They don't even know I'm Muslim yet. Or I don't know how to do this at work. I don't know how to do this here or there. You still gotta do like what you can. Do you know what I mean? Don't be in a place where that young woman who came to see me, who said, I was excited to practice wearing hijab, and then I talked to these Muslims and they made me feel like I'm terrible just because I thought I wanted to try it out sometimes. So get done what you can get done as you're building this relationship with it. But the fundamental understanding is that there's 5, and you do them in their windows of time. Do you get what I mean? Does that make sense? Any questions on that? Where and how we're going to go through over the course of the next couple of weeks, these other components, you build time into your routine, right? As you are learning these things, different language, different structure, it's really hard. You went an entire day without having to now figure out how to do this, and you have a routine, and now you have to build these things in. The hardest part for a lot of people isn't going to necessarily just be about like the learning of words and these things, but how do I like create a new schedule for myself? I've lived so many years, and now I have to like figure out how to do something that I just never did before. That's why you gotta, it's gonna have some learning curves to it. Do you know what I mean? That's just the reality of it. You want to be reasonable with yourself in that space. So as you go, where you're adding as you learn things, but you're building into your routine, just deliberate time for learning. One of the things that we're going to do as we kind of move through the summer, we're going to bring back like kind of a buddy program that we had. We're going to do some kind of trainings so that people who want to help our convert community or those who are trying to build a relationship with the basics, they're in a place where we have kind of people are on the same page as to how they'll do that instruction and where they can be helpful. You bear with us, we apologize, but COVID threw off a lot of things for us. And being here at NYU has been great, but also the COVID protocol that they had was lifted well after many other places, and so we're trying to just get to where we would be. But those, we hope, are going to be things also that help in the process as people are trying to learn things. So you're not just turning to the internet alone. So the other things I'll say here is that this is according to the Hanafi school of legal thought. It's a Sunni school of thought. You can go online and type in different things that would give you different perspectives on some of this, right? But that doesn't make it better or worse or more or less valid. There's different evidences and different opinions to it, and they're based off of like an entire methodology, And I would say with your prayer, just because it's an important thing, right? It's different from like reading other stuff. One of the things you want to do is just double check with somebody in person if you're engaging something online, and you'll find also like different sites adopt different methodologies that it'll seem like they're in conflict with each other, but they're really not. They're just kind of adding like a different kind of prism to it, so to speak, if that makes sense, right? And we're here to help in whatever way we can on this. And we'll take it very seriously because we are in a place where, it's one, our own accountability with God, but two, like it's supposed to be like an oasis, your prayer, like a place that is not going to feel a certain way. You might not know what it's doing to you, but it's still replenishing in some capacity, right? So getting the form and the mechanics down so that anxiety subsides, and then it allows for it to have the openings that it's meant to have. The last thing that I wanted to say was, someone might say like, well, why is it not just everything fits into some of these boxes neatly, right? That we look at something and just through its meaning, you can say, well, it's either prohibited or obligatory. One, like scholars of the past, they were very hesitant in naming something as being strictly prohibited or obligatory unless there was a concrete basis to this, because what they were trying to do was, as best as they can, understand what God wanted from them, right? And what God ultimately wants from all of us. And so the goal wasn't like, let's just become as restrictive as possible or just label things like absent-mindedly, right? So these terms have actual meanings to them, and they are going to only say you are obligated to do something or prohibited to do something if it was definitively understood that these are what these things were. And where you get these other categories in that spectrum is because there was a hesitation in saying you have to do something if that wasn't something that was just explicitly, clearly understood. Do you know what I mean? Right? And so as you're talking to people, and they might not know these things, right? They just attach words and qualifications. You want to orient yourself to kind of the base of some of these so that you're able to familiarize, as people are saying, and somebody could tell you, well, this is like you have to do this thing. You could be like, no, like I learned these are the things I have to do, right? Those are other things that are important, but they're not in that kind of level of categorization. Do you get what I mean? Does that make sense? Yeah, go ahead.
For the final sitting, can you just elaborate on that? Is that just like the final position of the prayer? Or?
Yeah, so you're gonna be in like the final sitting, like the kneeling position.
Okay, yeah.
And that's like what that is.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you all so much. So we'll see everyone next Wednesday, and we'll continue with what are the necessary components of the prayer, inshallah. All right.
We hope you enjoyed our podcast. If you're inspired by the work that we're doing at the IC and want to help keep it going, subscribe to our podcasts, follow us on social media, donate to help support us at ICNYU.org, and most importantly, keep us in your continued du'as. Until next time, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.